It began on July 28th of 1914. It ended November 11th of 1918. The Great War. Remember, it was the war to end all wars. 9 million people were killed. It was the fifth deadliest conflict in world history. As a result of that violence of the war to end all wars, in 1925, Pope Pius XI instituted the feast that we celebrate this weekend, the Feast of Christ the King, a feast to announce to the world that violence is not the answer, that the answer is the King of Peace. Back then, it was celebrated the last Sunday of October. 45 years later, at the end of one of the most violent decades, the 1960s, the date was changed. Paul VI placed it at the end of the church year to prepare us to enter into the Advent season and open up our hearts to the Prince of Peace. Once again, at the end of a violent decade, the message that was given to us is that the answer to violence is the King of Peace, not more violence. It was 50 years ago this weekend. Those of us old enough to remember sat transfixed in front of our television sets for 4 days. We were in shock, grieving, confused. A young president was shot. The country literally stopped for 4 days. There was an eerie silence on the streets. Sports games and TV programs were canceled. The lights of Broadway were turned off. We grieved. And the violence continued right in front of our eyes as Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald right on national TV. For those old enough, those were long and sobering 4 days. And little did we know that the violence was just beginning. It was a decade of assassinations, race riots, the war in Vietnam. And the decade ended in Woodstock, where thousands of confused young people attempted to sing the world to peace. Those 4 days changed our world drastically. We lost our innocence, and we needed to be grounded. If you remember, the decade started out with such great hope. John the 23rd opened up the windows of the church and let fresh air in. A young Catholic was elected president. Martin Luther King Jr. had a dream. In a very well-crafted article, Joan Chittister writes of these 3 men. She writes, "They warned us, all of them, JFK, Martin Luther King, John the 23rd, to examine our policies and change our hearts, to open our arms and expand our souls, to stretch our minds beyond parochialism and chauvinism and domination, or doom ourselves to watch the country destroy itself at its own hand." And in the article, she asks the question, where are we now 50 years later? Well, the violence hasn't ended. It has only expanded to the point that we're scared to send our children to school in the morning, or shop in a mall, or go to a movie theater, because people with guns are everywhere. This feast, this weekend, the Feast of Christ the King, is meant to ground us. The church gave us this feast in the midst of the war to end all wars, and at the end of a decade that changed our world forever. It's a feast that once again shouts out at our world that violence is not the answer. And the church year now ends with this great feast. Next week we enter into the reflective season of Advent. Yet, so few people enter into this season in a reflective manner. In many ways, it has become a season of violent consumerism, wherein families are robbed of precious time together because Madison Avenue is telling us that if we forfeit Thanksgiving dinner, there's a cheap TV waiting for us at Walmart. Just a few months before he was murdered, in June of '63, John Kennedy gave the commencement speech at American University. He called for the most soul-changing conversion of heart at the height of the Cold War, a conversion the world had never heard before. He asked us to examine our own individual attitudes towards peace. He told us that we must begin by going inward. And he said this, he said, "Too many of us think it's impossible. Too many think it's unreal. But that is a dangerous and defeatist attitude. We need not accept that we are doomed. Our problems are man-made, and no problem of human destiny is beyond us as human beings. Our reason and our spirit have often solved what we thought was unsolvable. We can do that again." He died a few months later. Violence is all around us. Right here in Syracuse, almost on a daily basis, we see shootings in our streets, but shootings in schools around our country as guns are so readily available. Kennedy was right. To stop the violence, each one of us has to go inward and realize that we are not doomed, but we can solve what seems so unsolvable. And this is the challenge of the Feast of Christ the King. It has to start with each one of us. Each one of us needs to head into the Advent season and use this as a valuable season to reflect upon the violence in our own lives. The violence we do to our families by our too busy lives, the violence that we perpetuate by gossip, the violence we perpetuate by our tongues, the violence we perpetuate with our prejudices and racist attitudes, the violences that we perpetuate with our rigidity and lack of openness, and the list goes on. 50 years ago this weekend, the same exact weekend, the weekend right before Thanksgiving, we had an experience that for those of us alive at the time, it wounded and scarred us. We remember all too well where we were that Friday afternoon when the gunshots fired in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. We were a wounded and grieving nation, and the scars are still mending. Much more violence has happened since that momentous weekend, and the memories of that tragedy still haunt us. On the Feast of Christ the King, at the end of this year of faith that Benedict called for last year at this time, the church challenges us to ground ourselves in a relationship with the King of Peace and spread that message wherever and whenever we can. It has to begin with each one of us.